Understanding social neuroscience requires an understanding of the neuroscience of the self. That's because our social interactions are deeply intertwined with how we understand ourselves, our goals, needs, desires, and dreads. Social cognitive neuroscience, one field that studies the brain in social circumstances, has discovered much regarding how our brains process information about ourselves and others. In this episode of the Thinking Tools podcast, I speak with Taylor Guthrie, the creator of one of my favorite YouTube channels, the Cellular Republic. There, Taylor provides university-level lectures on social neuroscience, as well as shorter videos that provide insight into other aspects of neuroscience. Taylor Guthrie is a PhD student at the University of Oregon, where his main focus is the study of social neuroscience. He is particularly interested in how our brains begin to represent social information in more similar ways to each other as we form close relationships with one another. It's something we talk about in this episode. His work explores the nature of the self at a neural level and seeks to uncover the ways in which the brain separates information about the self from information that is used to represent the various other people around us. He uses MRI and computational analysis methods to explore these various processes. By the way, if you're new to this channel, please hit the like and subscribe buttons, and don't forget to sign up for our weekly video newsletter. The link is in the caption, or you can go to senseofmindshow.com/newsletter. Now, without further ado, my conversation with Taylor Guthrie. All right, so I will have read your full bio for the audience, but would you just kind of explain a little bit about your background and why you decided to study social neuroscience?
Yeah, absolutely. So I am currently a fifth year PhD student at the University of Oregon. I got my master's here as well, but I did it with a different advisor that I'm with right now. So I did my master's work looking at the emotional modulation of memory. So how our associative memories, our ability to put kind of two things together, is affected by how our heightened state is. So if you think of like eyewitness type stuff during this really traumatic type situation, we actually found evidence that your hippocampus, the portion of your brain that's responsible for memory, actually starts shutting down. So it starts to kind of destroy some of these memory processes that are really important in those types of events. I found though that that memory research is very it's very competitive. There's a lot of people kind of in that domain, and me too. I'm kind of a generalist when it comes to wanting to know about the brain. I mean, there's just so many fascinating angles that you can take when you look at the brain itself and how all of the information is flowing through it and being processed. And social neuroscience is this really kind of new field, and it's very broad. You can ask these really big questions. You can create these data sets that you can ask like tons of different questions from different angles from. And so I found another advisor here that was doing some really cool work collecting groups of individuals and studying what's going on in their brain when they're thinking about themselves and what's going on in their brain when they're thinking about friends that they know and things like this. And when it comes to, I mean, when you look at kind of evolutionarily, we are the most social species on the face of the planet. And pretty much thinking about from like a generalist view, social cognition relies on everything. Right? It relies on attention. It relies on visual and audio and face processing and putting all of these perceptions together into these coherent models of people and their behavior, and just a really, really fascinating field of study. And so that really kind of brought me in. What started me in brain science in general, I have a little sister that's got cerebral palsy, and she was born severely deaf, and my whole life I've kind of just had this inclination trying to understand what happens in her brain, how she thinks, what kind of perceptions is she forming when she's never heard a word before.
Wow.
How does she dream, how does she and so these types of ideas really got me fascinated in the brain in general. When you look at an MRI of her brain, half of her brain is kind of it kind of looks like a solid mass, so to say. And so it's just kind of fascinating thinking about how different brains can process things in different ways and things like that. So kind of a long-winded answer, but
No, that's great. Yeah, that is fascinating. So within social neuroscience, you mentioned that you did some work in the emotional modulation of memory. What are you studying right now?
yeah. My main focus of study is actually looking at this really interesting phenomenon that's starting to come out of the social neuroscience literature. A lot of people have called it neural homophily. It's this idea of birds of a feather flock together. We're starting to see that as we become friends with one another, as we become close to one another, our brains actually start to represent information in a similar way. Um, we're not sure if there's like a chicken or the egg type thing there, where it's like, are we becoming friends because we already saw the world the same way? Or is there some process where as we become friends, we start to kind of get on the same wavelength, so to say? And some of my work has gotten at this. I have a recent publication that looked at how our representations of our friends, so let's say it's you, me, and one other person, the way that we see that other person is going to be very similar if you and I are really close friends. And
Wow, that's amazing. Sorry, go ahead.
no. Yeah, it's like at a neural level, the pattern of activity becomes very similar. And we have kind of measures of how close these people were to one another and how good of friends they were. And as those numbers go up, the similarity goes up.
Wow, that is really fascinating. So at what level of like neural activity do you see that kind of similarity?
So we're doing something called multivoxel pattern analysis, which, I mean, it's this kind of fancy phrase that's basically saying that we're looking for large scale patterns of information, right? So when we do MRI research, we're putting you in this giant magnet. This magnet's doing some magic with the protons in your brain, creates this image that's really just a bunch of intensity values. And those intensity values are representative of blood flow, but we can kind of infer that it's a bunch of activity that's happening. And we're taking measurements in these little 2 millimeter by 2 millimeter cubes. There's hundreds of thousands of them. And what we can do is we can look at across an entire swath of brain. So let's say we're looking at a piece of the frontal cortex. We can take that piece and we can look at the pattern of activity in that region of the brain. So this little portion is really active, this little portion is kind of active, this one's medium, and that whole constellation of activity, you can take that from one person and you can compare that whole constellation to a constellation in somebody else's brain in that same brain region. You kind of line their brains up so that you're looking at the same region in both people. And those, it's kind of that pattern of activity that is the same across people. And it's not, I mean, I think it's really important too, to distinguish that it's not this kind of whole brain, like the whole brain myth of like, you only use 10% of your brain. There's a reason we're only using certain parts of our brain at certain times, because we're not doing everything all the time. And so when I'm talking about these similarities that we're seeing, it's in very specific brain regions that we know to be involved, say, in social cognition or in high level perceptual type activity.
Wow. Yeah. Okay. That really makes sense. So it's kind of the pattern across the whole, or I guess whatever region of interest you're looking at, and then looking at the voxel, the individual voxels. That's very cool. I didn't want to get too off track there, but I still had another question for you. So we were talking a little bit, I think, before we started recording about the science communication aspect. So kind of talked a little bit about what drove you to become a scientist and study this in particular. But why did you want to start a YouTube channel, and what makes you want to kind of spread neuroscience to everyone else?
Yeah. It actually started. We had kind of a shortage of faculty members, and we had tons of senior students, University of Oregon, and they ended up bringing me on to teach one of these senior level courses, and it was Cog Neuro. And I started looking at the materials for the course that were given to me, and they were a little bit antiquated. They were teaching brain science like we were still learning what we learned from like lesion studies, and it wasn't really getting into the fact that like we've been using MRI and these really cool high tech kind of devices, EEG, MEG, all of these really cool things. And so I kind of updated the curriculum and created this course from scratch. And this was pre-pandemic. This was like right at the beginning of the pandemic. I mean, I think the end of my term was like when it all started. But I kind of had this view, it's kind of normal practice now, but I recorded all of my lectures. And it was a way of like giving my students a way to engage with it in another way or whatever. But after that class, I ended up editing out all the student questions and all of that. And I was like, you know what? I think that education should be more widespread. There's so many things that are just kind of hidden behind these paywalls, especially academic research, publication journals, all of these things. And so it was a way of me just kind of putting this information out there. If you want to learn about the brain, here's 16 lectures on how the brain works, from attention and decision making and social cognition and all of these different things. And I honestly thought it was just going to be something that like a couple undergrads kind of stumbled across, but it really blew up. I mean, the first couple of months, they just started to get tons of traction. And now, I mean, you search cog neuro and my lectures are kind of one of the first ones that pop up. And I just started to see like hour by hour the view time go up, and I thought, you know, this is a really cool platform for outreach, for just getting the word out about this really cool research that we're doing now, because we're at this cusp with brain science that's so freaking cool. And I think the average person is so removed from it because they think that it's this like really complex, unreachable thing, but it's really not. If you can really distill it down into these kind of basic principles that are going on, I think that the average person can really gain some insight into how they can better themselves by understanding their brain and kind of take control of their attention and their memory processes and things like that. So I've kind of transferred now. I'm starting to try to make some videos that are less like lecture-y, more kind of pop science type thing. They take a lot of work. So doing a PhD, I have a 2-year-old at home. I have a wife that works too, so I try to get them out as much as I can. But yeah.
Yeah, well, you do a really good job distilling the science, as you're saying. And I do encourage anybody to check out the course. I mean, it's free. And how many lectures is it? 16? 16. Yeah. And they're like an hour long each. And not like, there's some lectures you listen to on YouTube and it's like not good sound quality. You can't hear the guy. It's like he's across the room and somebody asks a question, you don't know what they're saying. Yours it sounds like the mic was really close to you, and it was, you can't see you, but you see all your slides, and it's all really good. Great stuff. So yeah, I encourage anybody who wants an introduction to cognitive neuroscience, check out your channel. All right. So speaking of that, let's get into social neuroscience. Yeah. So you talked a little bit about what social neuroscientists study and how it's a very wide, kind of a really wide ranging field. Would you say there's like a typical experimental paradigm, or is it just really kind of across the board?
It's interesting. I think if you were to ask me that question a couple of years ago, I'd say there probably is some typical paradigms, but where the technology is going, there's actually, it's kind of blowing up into this really kind of cool, innovative space. People are using a lot of these new kind of artificial intelligent algorithms, these machine learning algorithms to really dig into the brain in a different way than we have before. A lot of the early work had to do with trying to figure out kind of what the self was. I mean, it's this age-old philosophical question, like, what is the self? But it's actually one of the most robust and reliable signals in any MRI experiment across all of these different domains, across attention, across memory research, whatever. You can find it in one subject, You put them in a scanner, you tell them to think about themselves, same part of the brain lights up every single time. And it's this medial portion of the frontal cortex. And it's kind of low. It's what you would consider kind of ventral, kind of down low on the inside wall of the frontal cortex. But when you ask people about their traits, so are you a lazy person? Are you an empathetic person? And they think about who they are. And they do this kind of introspection. That self region lights up. When you ask them about things that they own, like, is this yours? Is this not yours? When they're thinking about things that they own, the self region lights up. So all of these kind of just self-referential processes are all going through this one brain region. And so a lot of the early social neuroscientists were looking at kind of how is this region different from the regions that we use to kind of think about other people, right? So when we're doing things like theory of mind and thinking about the fact that you kind of have a perspective of your own, you have traits of your own, thinking about who you are, we get a reliable set of regions that pop up when we're doing that too. And it's kind of in a similar area. It's still kind of in the frontal cortex, but it's higher up. And this really interesting early work started to notice that when the other person was manipulated, so if the other person was, say, close to you or similar to you, right? They have this other person that has the same political ideology as you, or is like your best friend or something like that. That what they started to notice was that the activity that's usually up in this like other area started to migrate down into the self area. And that's like, and they started to say, like, is it this simulation theory idea? Are we using ourself as a template for understanding people that are close to us or similar to us? Because it's efficient if you think about it, right? It's like, I know a lot about myself. So if you're really similar to me, if you're really close to me, then I can use what I know about myself to make predictions about you. But if you are not like me at all, you start falling up into these other areas that we think may be kind of stereotypical thinking, using these kind of general archetypes to understand who you are and what you may be doing. And so that's where a lot of the fields really was at. Now we're starting to get into some really cool paradigms that are starting to bring in what they call naturalistic stimuli. So they're having people listen to full audio podcasts, and they're having people watch full movies, which is very different than MRI has been done in the past. I mean, MRI research was usually this thing where you show someone a static image and then you take it away, and you're looking at like what the brain did in that one moment, right? But we're starting to develop these analysis techniques that we can see, instead of just like showing something and taking away, which the brain doesn't really see the world like that, right? We show this naturally unfolding thing, and we're able to kind of track the activity levels in these different regions of the brain. And if we're talking social neuroscience, let's say you're showing a movie to somebody and there's a scene where there's just kind of scenery, there's grass, there's mountains, whatever, and all of a sudden someone walks onto the screen. You can see there's a certain region of the brain that starts to, when that person walks on the screen, you're like, okay, this region of the brain is probably involved with understanding social movement, understanding that there are people in the film, people in your point of view, whatever it is. And they're able to kind of compare this across tons of people and see like, okay, this is reliably happening across all of these people. This region of the brain is probably tracking some type of social information. So it's really kind of blown up into a bunch of different dimensions. There's a lot of people that are studying kind of how the brain tracks things like personality, how it tracks different social structures within the community that you're a part of, like social norms and things like that. So it's a really cool field.
It is. Wow. Yeah. I mean, there's so much there we could go into. Well, since you mentioned the self and its relationship, why it's so relevant to social neuroscience, I thought we could talk a little bit more about kind of the neuroscience of thinking about ourselves and others. And you mentioned the medial frontal cortex. But another prominent kind of, I guess, network in the brain is the default mode network. And I wonder if you could explain its role in social cognition a little bit.
Yeah, absolutely. Default mode is it's like my bread and butter. It's a very interesting network, and it's the term for it, default mode, is a really interesting term that was picked for it, and it's because of the fact that the discovery of it was actually during kind of this early MRI research where they were more interested in kind of these external type processes, right? And you're having them do things, you're having them pay attention to something or push a button or do this or do that. And what they noticed was that when the participant wasn't doing anything, when they were just mind wandering, when they were just sitting there, when it was kind of between trials, there was this whole network of brain regions that would come online. And so they were like, okay, this is the default portion of the brain. This is what comes on when nothing else is happening, right? And there's been a lot that's happened since then. We've really started to understand it in a different way. A lot of work has started to look at it more of kind of an intrinsic type network. It's a network that comes online when we're kind of thinking inwardly. And so there's a region called the TPJ, which is the temporal parietal junction, which is kind of the junction back here between the parietal lobe and the temporal lobe. It pops up in the default mode network. There's the PCC, which is kind of deep in the brain, kind of on the midline near the back, kind of near the visual cortex. And then there's the frontal cortex, especially these kind of medial regions that are involved in social cognition. And what we see is that the default mode is super active in any type of social cognition thing that you do, which makes sense because most social cognition is this kind of reflective process, right? It's like really kind of turning inward. It's thinking about these past experiences that you've had with these other people, these past experiences that you've had with yourself. And that right there, it was kind of my kind of go-to explanation for default mode for a long time. And I've actually come across some research recently that really turned my understanding of the entire brain on its head.
Wow.
There's a person named Uri Hasson, who I think is probably the leader in thought in MRI right now. He's done a lot of work with these naturalistic stimuli of like putting people in, having them listen to audiobooks and audio podcasts and all of these different kind of things. And he's noticed that there's this hierarchy of temporal processing. And so when I say temporal processing, I mean that there are certain areas of the brain that process things really, really quickly. And there are certain areas of the brain that are able to process information over really long periods of time. They're able to keep information online and kind of compare it with the new information that's coming in, right? And what you see is that your primary sensory cortices, so the primary auditory cortex is kind of the first part of the cortex that processes sound, right? And it's got this map of all of the tones that you hear. And that portion of the brain is processing things really quickly. As soon as a sound hits your ear, it's processing that frequency and then it's moving on to the next one. It's moving on, it's moving on. But as you move away from these kind of auditory primary regions or the primary visual cortex, you start to see that the regions surrounding it are able to keep track of longer periods of information. So let's say the auditory cortex, the primary auditory cortex, is processing the sounds that you're hearing right now. As you move away from it, you have a region that's not just keeping track of sound, but it's keeping track of words, right? It's able to put these things together into words and keep track of all of the different consonants and diphthongs and whatever it is, right? And as you move even further away from there, you start to encounter regions that are able to keep track of entire sentence structure, right? So noun verb agreement, and whether or not like the sentence structure actually makes sense. And then as you get even further, you start to see regions that are able to keep track of kind of paragraph information, where The only reason that I know what the word he or the pronoun he means is because it was identified as Bob 3 sentences ago, right? What we see is when you get into these regions that have a really high temporal window, they're able to keep track of really long periods of information, is when we really start getting into default mode. And default mode network is this region of network that has a really high temporal window. And so it's able to keep track of really long periods of information. And when you think about kind of the self, when you think about others, when you think about social cognition in general, we're collating tons of information, right? We're thinking about all of these different experiences that we've had with them. We're comparing it to new things that we're experiencing now. There's this integration process that's happening. And there's a lot of people that think that that's kind of the role of the frontal cortex. And that's why we see so much kind of frontal cortex activity when we're thinking about ourselves, is because it's this integration process. It's like thinking about all the things we know about ourselves and then taking this new information and saying, okay, is this self-relevant or is this not self-relevant? And it's really kind of, that's how my view of the default mode has kind of evolved, is that it's hard to say that like this region is the self region, because like, what is it really processing? You know, it's more of a mechanism that is really, really helpful for understanding things that are self-relevant, because self-relevant things are really important, things that we need to keep track of, things that we need to kind of like, we have goals and we have pursuits and all of these things that we need to do. And we need to take the sensory information that we're getting and saying, okay, is this kind of compatible with who I think I am, with the values that I have, with the goals that I have? Are we integrating this? Are we remembering this? And so, yeah.
Wow. Yeah, I had never heard that before. So the default mode network, correct me if I'm wrong, just trying to kind of summarize what you're saying. It's processing information on kind of the longest time scale that like we're able to process information on. Is that a good way of thinking about? Okay.
Absolutely. Yeah. I mean, you think of auditory cortex is like millisecond, second. Frontal cortex is months, years. We're able to really activate and bring on that memory type information and use it in kind of this feedback loop with those fast processing regions of like, okay, is this new information that's coming in, is it compatible with all of this stuff that I still have online?
Oh, wow. That's really cool. That's really cool. You say Uri Hasson is the?
Yeah, Uri Hasson,
Uri Hasson.
URI. He's got fantastic TED Talk. He does a bunch of language research in general.
Wow.
Yeah, they've found some incredible stuff. And the study that stands out the most to me is they brought in English speakers and Russian speakers, and they had both of these people listen to the same story, but the English people heard it in English and the Russians heard it in Russian. And what you would expect is that the auditory cortex is going to be completely different, because English people and Russian people are hearing completely different things, right? What was fascinating, though, was that these higher order regions that have these high temporal windows or whatever, they found really high similarity in the representation of the actual concepts. Even though these people were listening in Russian and these people were listening in English, the concepts were being represented in their brain in these high order regions in the same way.
Wow, that's really cool. You would think that the language would affect the concepts. I'm sure it does to maybe a small degree or something, but that's wow. That's really cool. So maybe we can get a little bit more into the prefrontal cortex, or the frontal cortex in general. I'm kind of working on a little project on the prefrontal cortex. So I have a hidden motivation there, but can you talk a little more about the frontal cortex in general and the prefrontal cortex in particular and their roles in social cognition?
Yeah, absolutely. I think that a lot of the role of the frontal cortex was really born out of motion, because you have kind of the premotor cortex is kind of that first section of the frontal cortex. And then I think that as evolution kind of proceeded, that we were able to take a lot of those principles that came from motion, and we're able to apply them to these kind of more broad construct, abstract things. Because if you think about motion, motion involves a lot of planning. It involves goals and pursuits, right? It's like, I need to plan to move my hand to pick up my coffee cup and take a drink, right? But we can see that that same process of thinking can be applied to lots of different types of goals, right? That we can start to form these really abstract goals of who I want to be and what kind of person I am and what my values and all of these different things are. And I think that as humans kind of evolved, that the frontal lobe started to really kind of keep track of all of this type of information. We see from a lot of different studies that goal type things, goal-oriented behavior is strongly represented in the frontal lobe, as is what a lot of people would call working memory. There's a lot of debates on like what working memory really is. But it's this idea, I think, that working memory is kind of what I was just talking about earlier, is this integration process. It's the fact that I think that the frontal lobe is responsible for really kind of keeping online all of these things that we feel are important to us. And that working memory is this process of seeing whether or not the information that we're receiving right now is kind of in line with that stuff. Is it something that we should keep online because it's in line with what our goals are? If we're hungry and it's information about where the next fast food place is, then we should probably keep it online, right? And so I think that the frontal lobe, and it's something that sets us apart from other animals in the animal kingdom. And I think a lot of it has to do with this ability to keep track of longer and longer periods of information. They do these delay to match sample tasks with monkeys. That's kind of our understanding of working memory. They have a monkey kind of with a couple of different dishes in front of them, and they put a treat down and then in a certain spot, and then they bring a shade down, right? And so the monkey has to remember what spot the treat was in. And they've noticed with these electrodes in the monkey's brain that there are neurons in the frontal lobe that will just stay active through that entire delay period. And so they're kind of keeping that information online so that when that shade comes back up, they're like, okay, it's right there. And so I think that largely was why the frontal lobe kind of evolved in the first place, was that we as a species, as monkeys even, like, we started to have more and more complex goals that required kind of longer and longer periods of time, that we were having to keep track of where this was and where that was. And think about like agriculture and having to keep track of an entire like growing season before we actually like pick the food or whatever it is. And so that's kind of my general understanding of the frontal lobe. And then kind of taking it to the social neuroscience side of it, is just kind of taking it that next step of saying, instead of these concrete type things that we're keeping online, we're keeping relationship type things online. Because that's really, really important to us as a species, is knowing whether or not we should trust someone, knowing whether or not we should like continue to work with this person, right? Did this person kind of screw me over in the past, and should I keep working with them now? And I think that those types of things, they're very similar types of processing. I mean, when you look at, you want to always kind of take this kind of like Occam's razor approach to the brain. Once it figures out how to do something, it can apply that same kind of principle to lots of different types of processing.
Wow. Yeah. Yeah. That is really cool. Really cool idea. Kind of using the abstracting the concrete of the frontal cortex's function. So there you mentioned a little bit about humans being uniquely social, and perhaps the frontal cortex being part of that, or the frontal lobe in general being part of that. So what do we know about humans being more social than other primates? Why, what kinds of experiments have been done to show that we're naturally more social, and in what ways does that show up?
I think some of the most important studies were actually the ones that showed what loneliness does to us. I mean, I think that that is the most telling in terms of like how important a certain process is to a species, is when you kind of take away their ability to do that. And you can look at this laundry list of negative health outcomes that come from removing your ability to be social and to isolate someone when someone feels like they've been ostracized. It's this really damning feeling, you know what I mean? Um, and I don't know, particularly in terms of like comparing like us to other animals, what kind of studies have really been done. But I think that the apes themselves are still very social creatures. I think that where a lot of the difference is in what those relationships are being utilized for, and what types of things need to be remembered. So you look at kind of a troop of chimpanzees or something, and the types of relationship qualities that need to be remembered are usually around like foraging type behaviors and grooming type behaviors and things like that, not really like complex things that need to be kind of looked at over really long periods of time. But then you look at the human society and the types of jobs that we do and the types of like social norms that we have to keep track of we need to behave this way in this setting, we need to behave this way in this setting. I think that those types of things are really what fueled the evolution of the frontal cortex in a different direction for humans, in my opinion. I don't know, that's kind of speculation from my part, but
Sure, sure. Yeah.
yeah.
Well, maybe we could jump into some of those effects of social isolation on the brain and people's psychology. So if there's any in particular that stand out to you, go for it.
Yeah, it's really interesting. A lot of scientists kind of put this need to belong kind of on the same level as thirst and as hunger. And it's because of the fact, like I said, that there's these just kind of dramatic health consequences that can happen, like if you stop drinking water or you stopped eating. There's a lot of benefits from being isolated, right? People take time alone for self-reflection, for spirituality, for all of these different types of things. But it's more of the feeling that you've been discluded from society, right? That you haven't been accepted by these other people around you, that I think really fuels a lot of the kind of depressive symptoms, which in turn can fuel a lot of these kind of HPA access, which is kind of your stress access of massive amounts of cortisol, which can then result in memory problems, can result in cardiovascular problems, all of these different types of things. And there's been some interesting work too that looks at like the self region and kind of depressive symptoms, and how there's like a lot of rumination that happens when you're kind of isolated, and you have kind of this overactive use of these regions, probably using them for the wrong purpose. Um, but yeah, it's a I think one of the most important things to us as humans is the quality of our relationships. And and I think that our brains are wired to track how accepted we feel.
Wow. Yeah, that definitely makes sense. I have a friend who's not a neuroscientist, but very interested in this stuff. And she says, we're not fully human without other people.
Yep.
Guess that's true. So I guess we could jump a little bit into what goes wrong with the social brain. So one thing that you mentioned in your lecture on self and the neuroscience of or the social neuroscience is antisocial personality disorder, and how the antisocial personality, the brain of someone with that disorder is a little bit different. I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about that.
It's not necessarily my forte. And so it would be kind of pure speculation.
Okay.
But
Okay.
it's
Gotcha.
Definitely been a while since I got into some of that stuff. But I mean, from the standpoint of just kind of taking what I do know about the social brain, um, my view on kind of how the brain works is that we have certain kind of networks and regions that are responsible for certain types of behavior, certain types of kind of activity and things like that. And I think that most kind of mental illness, most types of social disorders and things like that are really those regions kind of being used in an overactive way or being used kind of in an irregular way, where there's a lot more kind of like I kind of mentioned earlier, a lot more rumination on certain things that other people can kind of move past and compartmentalize and things like that. Um, and it's really interesting from kind of a just a social psychology perspective when you look at kind of these individual differences among people when it comes to how they actually want to engage in social life, right? I mean, the kind of obvious example is like extroverts versus introverts, right? You have these extroverted people are people that get kind of charged up by being around other people and sharing things with other people. And then you have these introverted people that are just like, man, this is exhausting. Like, I can't be around you anymore. And I think one of the coolest things about social neuroscience is that it's on the cusp of a lot of this stuff, where a lot of what we've been discussing, I think, is probably going to be revised in the next 10 years as we kind of break into more of these processes and really understand the flow of all of this information. But I think that it's all based on these kind of simple principles of whether or not you're attending to the right kind of information, where it's like, okay, if you have some type of disorder, is it because you're attending consistently to these negative aspects that are coming in, right? And you're just giving those a lot of weight, and your goals in your frontal lobe have been kind of taken hostage in a way of like, you have negative goals now. And so your attention mechanisms are actually looking for negative information and keeping track of negative information. And I think that all of that is, well, I mean, I can't speak for like massive amounts of like mental illness or anything, but there's a lot of power in plasticity and having insight into some of these processes in general, and really thinking about how we can rewire them to start tuning our attention mechanisms to look for positive information. And I think all of that comes down to goal setting, thinking about who we are as a person, our identity as a person. And that in turn fuels how our brain looks for information to prove that right or wrong.
Well, that's good. That is great, because I want to step back just a little bit and talk on kind of a broader level about the brain. And I think what you were just saying is a really good introduction to my kind of ridiculously general question that I'm asking all my guests, which is, can you give me an elevator pitch answer to the question of how the brain works?
Yeah, that's actually, I think that's one of my favorite questions, honestly, because like I said earlier, I'm very much a generalist when it comes to thinking about the brain, because even though I study social cognition, it involves all of these other processes. And what I think is really happening is that over the course of our evolution, not just as humans, but organisms in general, I think that the nervous system itself is kind of this biological government in a way, where it was born out of this need to find coordination, to find kind of resource allocation between these different communities of cells that all had different needs, right? And so you have, just like a society needs a government, you have the biology, all of these millions of cells that all have different needs. They all have a need for some type of governance as well. And so I think that it started with kind of this need to move, to explore the world, to sense the world and figure out how to meet our basic needs. And I think that as species evolved, it kind of followed in a way this kind of like Maslow's hierarchy of the brain first needed to accomplish physiological needs. It needed to make sure that all of these different communities of cells all had what they need to survive, right? Homeostasis was maintained, and that food was coming in and water was coming in, and then from there was this need to be able to protect itself, to achieve these kind of safety needs that the organisms had in general. And so you see these brain mechanisms start to come online. And when you look at kind of the older regions of the brain, they tend to be more involved in physiological structures or physiological type stuff. And then you start to see things like the locus coeruleus in the midbrain and these other regions that are really involved in like orienting type actions for like looking for danger and things like that. And if you think about a society, right? When a society has everything it needs, when it has food, when it has water, then you start to see specialization happen, right? And I think that that's where we started to see the kind of emergence of social behavior in general among all of these animals. They started to see that like working together kind of provided this benefit to the entire group. And so you start to see these brain structures that are starting to keep track of relationship stuff and all of these different things. And how I think it really works, I guess, in a general way, is that you have these very strict pathways of sense perception. So you have all of the senses come in, the senses all get kind of processed on their own. There's an auditory cortex, there's a visual cortex, there's a touch cortex, all of these different things. And so you have these regions of the brain that became representative. If you think of the government, it's like this representative government. It was like, all right, this part of the brain represents the toe, and this part of the brain represents this, right? And what you get at the end of it is what I like to view as kind of this like Greek forum, where you have all of these senators that are all like representative of different parts of the body and different parts of the goals of the society and different things. And whichever senator is able to demonstrate that their part of the body needs the most, they kind of have the most say, right? They're speaking the loudest. It's like you stub your toe, all of a sudden the toe senator is like, hey guys, you need to pay attention to me. And so I really think that in general, that type of a view of the brain gives us a lot of power as individuals, because it really, and that's the title of my channel is the Cellular Republic. That's kind of where a lot of that was born out of, is this idea that the nervous system itself is kind of this governing entity. And that puts us, who we refer to as me or I, that puts us kind of responsible for this entire community, right? We are like the emperor, the president, or whatever. I like to think of it as like Marcus Aurelius, the philosopher king or whatever of the society that is us. And if you think about any type of government, their main role is really to understand their populace, is to understand what their people need. And so I think that that's really the goal of the brain, and that's why we have this self-activity, and why self-activity is so robust, is because it's really trying to understand how to take care of itself. It's trying to understand what the different cells that make it up actually need. And I think that that's what really drives a lot of stuff. And today's society, we get pretty far away from that, because our brain is also devised this way to create symbols that really distract away from all of these different things. But that's my that's kind of my soapbox answer for.
That's excellent. I've never heard it described that way. I've sometimes heard analogies to democracy or government, but never in that the way that you've spelled it out. And that's really cool. I did not put that together with the name of your channel, but okay, great answer.
Thanks.
Yeah. Okay, so I know we're getting a little bit close to our time, although actually, how much time do you have?
I'm good.
Okay.
Yeah.
Cool. Well, all right. Well, I'll just ask you this one. So since we're talking about the brain overall, is there a book that you would recommend to people that if they could only read one book about the brain, it would be that one?
Yeah, I think David Eagleman is like one of my idols. There are some things that I kind of disagree, especially when it comes to like free will. There's a lot of neuroscientists that just like completely disagree with the idea of free will. I don't believe in free will. I think the word free is stupid, because anything that we do is constrained by our environment, by our circumstances, by all of these kind of things. But his kind of overall view of the way that the brain works is really, really cool. He's got a new book out called Livewired. It's really good. And it really paints this picture similar to what I was saying, where it really looks at how we're created from billions of individual cells that are all alive, that are all competing for resources. And that's something that I think we really forget when we think about the brain as a whole or whatever it is. And it starts to make a lot of things really make sense. Like he has this really interesting idea about dreaming, where if you look, there's a lot of really interesting studies about regional takeover. So if you go blind, then you have certain parts of your brain will start to take over the visual cortex. And he has this whole idea that dreaming is actually this way of the visual cortex to protect itself from the other regions of the brain, that it's this like chaotic world out there where it's like everyone for themselves. And so they had to come up with, the visual cortex had to come up with a way to stay online for 12 hours of darkness every day so that the other parts of the brain wouldn't take it over.
Yeah, that is a great book. I just finished that a couple of weeks ago, but yeah, that he was one of the guys I was going to say that your answer reminded me of David Eagleman. But yeah, that idea about dreaming and everything is just it's amazing. But actually just want to backtrack a little bit onto free will, because that's something I'm really interested in. And I have I think, as we all do, a little bit of a tough time thinking about it. When you get thinking about it more and more, it becomes more and more confusing. So do you believe, you said you don't believe in free with capital F free will, but what is your view of free will?
Yeah, I think it's very much tied in with this philosophy that I've developed about the brain in general, and this kind of analogy that I use to it being this form of governance. I don't think that meaningful change is possible without will. I think that the brain is set up in sort of a way. If you go and watch I have a lecture on consciousness that kind of gets into this idea of this kind of multi-layered perspective of consciousness. I think that individual cells are conscious to a certain extent. I think that they are somewhat sentient. I wouldn't say that they're making complex decisions, but I think that they feel alive, that they want food, that they want to stay alive and maintain themselves. And I think that there's kind of this hierarchy of consciousness, where if you look at, I'm really big into philosophy. I love like philosophy podcasts and things like that, and really looking at how our ideas about the self and all of these things have evolved over thousands of years. And Jean-Jacques Rousseau has this idea of the general will, and it was his attempt at trying to understand government in society. And it's something that I kind of took and applied to biology. And it was this idea that when you have individuals that come together and have some type of shared purpose, that something is kind of created out of that union, something that can kind of be treated as an individual that makes decisions for the whole and kind of takes responsibility for the whole. And that was kind of his idea of government in general. And I had the same idea with biology. You have all of these living cells that all have this kind of common purpose, that all share this common purpose, and that something is kind of born out of that the mind is actually this general will of the entire biology. And I think that general will is making decisions. I think that there's a lot of talk about will being this just kind of illusion or whatever. And there have been a lot of examples, even in a lot of David Eagleman's books, about the type of people that get brain damage, and so they're not able to make the same types of decisions and things like that. But my argument for that is that a leader is only able to make decisions based on the information that they have, right? And so if you have a certain part of your brain that's damaged, that means that the leader is getting faulty information and is making decisions based on the wrong type of information. But I think that that will is still making decisions. And I think one of the most important things to me about will, and I think the reason that I'm so kind of that I advocate so much for the existence of will, is because it gives you ownership over your ability to make change in your life. I mean, I'm a huge proponent of neuroplasticity, of the ability that you have to really think about how it is that your brain works. What are the type of decisions you're making? What's the behavior that you're exhibiting? And if you can think about where those behaviors are coming, you can change them, right? And I don't think that that's possible without some type of will. And I know that there's like some philosophical loopholes that people can wrap me into that may produce some fallacies or whatever. But I think it's interesting because you very quickly get into this like philosophical quicksand of I try to think about consciousness and like the brain. Think about a smartphone, right? A smartphone has a layered architecture where you have all of these different modules that are processing different types of information. And these modules will send all of their information up to these ones, which then process this. And then they send their stuff up to this one, which then processes this. And as it kind of goes up the hierarchy, you have this integration happening, and you have the information getting more and more complex until you're eventually at a screen that has this beautiful user interface or whatever. But then there's someone that uses the screen, right? And that's how I kind of see the mind, is that the mind is using the information that the brain is creating. It creates this kind of weird dualistic approach where it's like, is the mind something separate from the brain? I don't know. I personally don't think that they're separable, that once the brain dies, I think the mind dies. I think it's created by the activity of the biology. But I mean, I think that's my kind of long-winded answer for saying, yes, I think that will exists. I think that I can decide to pick my phone up and put it back down. I can put it upside down. I can turn it sideways. But it's not free. Nothing is free. And that's kind of the problem I have with the term itself, is that I believe in will, but I believe in extremely constrained will, because there is so much in our brain that we don't have control over. I mean, our access to information is the tip of the iceberg, but we're using that tip of the iceberg to make the best decisions that we can to change our lives in a meaningful way.
I get you. Yeah. Yeah. And it's, I guess to drill down on that a little more, and I agree with the idea that the concept itself of free will is just confused and makes these conversations harder to have. But I mean, I guess what I always run up against in this is thinking about like coming to a similar position of what you're saying, but then thinking, well, kind of as you were just alluding to, that if the mind is a product of the brain and the mind is the will, well, then isn't the will just, interactions among neurons and ultimately comes down to these physical chemical reactions that are just happening and just part of kind of the causal net of the universe.
Yeah, no, and that's I mean, you talk to any molecular neuroscientist, and that's like,
and that's where I came from.
Right, exactly. Yeah, it's like, well, this hydrogen ion hits this one, which causes this cascade, and I mean that gets into this just like unbreakable chain of causation, and I think that there's more to consciousness that we don't understand yet, and I know that's kind of a cop-out answer, but I think that just like the leader of a country can choose to follow the information that they're given or choose not to, I think the will too can choose to use all of that information that the neurons are giving it, or can choose to do something different. And I think that's what really breaks the chain of causation, is that that the mind has created a way to gain insight into its own behavior in order to change it.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, I don't think we're going to solve this particular paradox right here, but one other thing I wanted to ask you about there that it just was really interesting. You mentioned that you think that neurons themselves may be conscious or feeling in some way. Do you think that applies to all cells? And then how far down does it go? Do you think that even molecules are in some sense conscious?
Yeah, I mean, that's what you end up in. I had a really cool philosopher professor that I walked through tons of this stuff with for hours, and that was always what we came back to, where it was just like, well, if we're saying it's here, then it's got to be all the way down, right? Because it's just like, okay, well, 1,000,002 molecules are not conscious, but 1,000,003 molecules are. And you really start to get into kind of these kind of mysticism type holes with a lot of this stuff. But I think that there probably is a level of consciousness in matter itself. And I think it gets into kind of old Greek philosophy too, of kind of the origins of the universe. A lot of that stuff ended up tying in with a lot of what we've figured out astrophysics wise with the Big Bang and things like that. This idea that everything was one, that it was this one thing. And in my mind, that one thing was probably conscious. And that one thing split into a bunch of little things that all kind of maintained some level of it. And that what we experience as our consciousness is probably a lot different than consciousness at other levels. But I'm not ruling out the possibility that a rock is conscious.
That I understand that. That's sort of the panpsychism view. And it really does, as weird as it sounds, it can make a lot of sense in the way that you're talking about. Oh, looks like your video.
Did I freeze? There we go.
Oh, you're back there. All right, cool. Well, I think that was a nice little poetic, maybe an ending for us. It's been just really fun talking to you, Taylor. Thank you so much for answering all my questions. I know some of them were a little out there, and I appreciate you jumping in and giving me an answer.
No, this was a lot of fun. I appreciate this, and I'd be down to do this again, because there's so much about the brain, and like I said, I mean, my lectures get into like all of these different facets, and so if we ever want to talk attention, if we ever want to talk decision making, anything like that, this would be a really cool place to do it.
That sounds great to me. I'm definitely open to it. I'd love to set up another one soon.
Awesome, thanks, Andrew.
Yeah, thanks again. And maybe just real quick, tell everybody where they can find you.
Yeah. So my YouTube channel is the Cellular Republic. There's, I think, like I said, like 16 lectures about the brain. I actually just taught a class on group dynamics, so social kind of psychology in general. So I plan on putting all those up as well. So, nice. And then there's just some kind of pop psych type videos too that I love making. So
awesome. Well, I'll point people to that. I'll link it to it. And thanks again, Taylor. I hope you have a great rest of your day and the rest of your week.
Yeah, you too. It was good meeting you, Andrew.
You too. Talk to you later.
Well, that's it. Thank you so much for listening or watching this episode of the Thinking Tools podcast from Sense of Mind. Please be sure to like and subscribe to the YouTube channel and subscribe to the podcast. Also, consider giving this show a 5-star rating on whatever podcast platform you use. And as always, this channel is brought to you by the Diamond Mind Foundation. This episode was written and produced by me, Andrew Cooper Sansom. Thank you so much for watching. I'll catch you next time.